I have the gladness of introducing Byron Rushing. Byron is an active Episcopalian. He has been elected lay deputy to the Episcopal Church's General Convention. He has been the chaplain to the House of Deputies in 1994 and the first lay person to hold this position. He serves as the vice president of the House of Deputies, the highest elected body or position held by a layperson in the Episcopal Church. And Byron was a longtime member of the ECM board. We are proud to proclaim and claim in the 70s and 80s. And during all his time in Boston, Byron has been a tireless advocate, community organizer for community-based organizations for greater political participation against neighborhood debilitation. And he continues this work to increase the understanding of the history of the poor and working class people in this state and in Boston, and heads the Roxbury Historical Society, and is on the leadership team of the Massachusetts Reparations Community of Practice. So I am going to pass it back to Angel, who will ask Byron the first question before his address. And welcome, Byron.
So first off, I want to thank you for joining us today, Vice President Rushing. So we would like to start with our first question. The very Reverend Dr. Kitty Brown Douglas has said that for faith communities, reparations must not only be an effort to compensate for past harms, they must also chart a pathway to a just future. Can you speak briefly on your role in helping Episcopalians in the Commonwealth chart that pathway?
Good morning to you all, and it is always good to be with the Episcopal City Mission. What we now call America, a name that is about 500 years old, is a collection of countries and nations with founders, people founders. The indigenous people who arrived here tens of thousands of years ago, the imperial Europeans who attacked and invaded those lands, and the Africans who the Europeans stole and brought here as property to supply the labor for the Europeans to exploit the vast resources of these lands. America's founding peoples, who European Americans would come to call the red, the white, and the black. They are the founders of the Americas, the founders of the United States of America. Slavery and the slave trade in the Americas has existed longer than emancipation and the period of civil rights has yet existed. If you use 1619 as the approximate date of the introduction of slavery in North American British colonies, which would become part of the United States of America, slavery lasted 246 years. It will not be until 2111 that people of African descent will have been free as long as they have been enslaved in the United States. If I wanted to be more accurate and be to the complication of all of this history, I would add that we should not leave out the Spanish colonies that eventually became part of the United States. And then we'd have to go even further back. It was 1513 that the first Africans were brought to Florida. The story of Black Episcopalians, like the story of Native Indigenous Episcopalians, is of course intricately tied to this history. It begins with the Church of England and the invasion of North America and the Caribbean by the English. And for Episcopalians, Black Episcopalians, it also is informed by the decision of the Church of England, and after the American Revolution, the American War of Independence, to be more accurate, by the Protestant Episcopal Church in vigorously supporting African and Black enslavement and vigorously supporting the African slave trade by its members. As you listen to this outline, commit to do this history yourself. Commit to do the history of your own congregation. Unless you were founded after the 1960s, your congregation has a piece of this story in its history. Find it, research it, write it down, and above all, publish it. Publish it on your website. The first Africans arrived in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619, 12 years after this first permanent British settlement in North America was established. Although there are many records of early baptisms of indigenous people during this time, including Pocahontas, we know little about the interaction of the Church of England and Africans until the English settlement of South Carolina and the arrival in the colonies of SPG missionaries, Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts missionaries to these colonies. The earliest known record of groups of baptisms of Africans is in Goose Creek Parish in South Carolina in 1695. Once Anglican enslavers were convinced that baptism would not affect the status of the enslaved, the missionary clergy were allowed and sometimes encouraged to work among the Africans, especially their children. Another history of Black Episcopalians began after the War of Independence and in the North, coinciding with the first years of the newly established denomination independent of the Church of England, the Protestant Episcopal Church. These were the congregations founded by freed and enslaved, formerly enslaved African Americans in the 1790s. First by a group of Black Philadelphians, the Free African Society, and its leaders, Absalom Jones and Richard Allen. After undergoing a growing discrimination in the white churches they were allowed to attend, they decided to organize an independent congregation. When a defining disagreement arose over a denominational connection, the majority of the members of that Black congregation decided to approach the Episcopal Church under Absalom Jones's leadership. And the others followed Richard Allen, who wished to remain connected to the Methodists. He founds a separate congregation, Mother Bethel, and eventually a denomination, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Absalom Jones organizes the original congregation into St. Thomas African Episcopal Church and approaches Bishop White, who ordains him a deacon and then first presbyter in the Black presbyter in the Episcopal Church in 1802. That was 107 years after the first recorded baptism of Africans in Goose Creek Parish. In 1818, in New York City, led by Peter Williams, St. Philip's is organized. And around 1825 in Baltimore, St. James is organized. All Black congregations led by Black clergy in Baltimore by William Levington. In 1860, On the verge of the Civil War, most baptized Black Anglicans in the United States were in the South and were enslaved. In 1861 began the largest schism in the history of the Episcopal Church, and in 1832, the Protestant Episcopal Church in the Confederate States of America came into being. In 1865, there were only 26 Black ordained clergy in the church. 9 were in those northern Black parishes, 16 were missionaries in Liberia, and 1 was organizing a church in Haiti. In 1875, there were virtually no Black Episcopalians in the South. After the Civil War, most had moved to join African Methodist congregations and later Black Baptist congregations, which could now be independent with Black leadership in the South. White Southern leadership in Episcopal churches in the South was having little or none of that. However, the need and growing request from the Black Episcopalians who did remain in the South was for ordinations, for Black clerical leadership of their congregations. This did lead the Southern bishops to act. They organized the Bishop Payne Divinity School in 1874, a racially segregated seminary named for the first white bishop of Liberia. It was an example of the Episcopal Church's policy on race after the clergy and laity of the schismatic Episcopal Church of the Confederacy were allowed back into the Episcopal Church with no criticism or call for any change on their part. Virtually all of the white leadership and membership of the Episcopal Church after the Civil War, North and South, continued on in support of racial segregation in the church and in society. As Southern bishops adopted plans for structural canonical segregation in dioceses and institutions, the slowly growing number of Black clergy and laity began to organize to prevent it. They organized the Conference of Church Workers among Colored People in 1883. They were able to prevent this structural segregation in the national church, a structural segregation that had occurred in the predominantly white Methodist church. They were not able to prevent individual Southern bishops from incorporating further racial discrimination in their own dioceses. And eventually in 1918, 2 Southern dioceses choose to appoint and consecrate Black suffragan bishops to serve the Black members of those dioceses: Edward Demby in Arkansas and Henry Delaney in North Carolina. Until the end of World War II and the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, the Episcopal Church was racially segregated in all its institutions from bottom to top. The idea and concept and action toward a racially integrated Episcopal Church did not become widely discussed until then, the 1950s and early 60s. In Boston, Emmanuel Church on Newbury Street has just begun to take another look at its involvement in racial segregation in this diocese. They established a church in the South End, a predominantly white working class church called Ascension. In the 1920s, its rector and vestry became concerned about the growing number of Black people who were joining that church, and that rector decided to ask them all to leave just about the time that St. Cyprian's was getting founded in Roxbury. Organized Black Episcopalians were joined by growing numbers of white liberals in the church. Interracial organizations like ESPRU, the Episcopal Society for Cultural and Racial Unity, were founded. The first public statement by a presiding bishop in support of civil rights occurred in 1963. Gradually, this coalition of the baptized has brought about a church that we consider common, a church that could say, will you seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbor as yourself? A church that could ask, will you strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being? This is the Episcopal Church that now begins in the 60s and 70s. It is an Episcopal Church that is only 70 years old.
Thank you so much, Representative Rushing. And just to ask a follow-up question for you, I'm struck by just the role of truth-telling and memory in this work of repentance and repair, and would love to hear you speak on why that act of truth-telling and the role of memory is so important.
Over the past several years, I have been so moved by Indigenous people acknowledging and asking us all to always acknowledge the first peoples on whatever land we are now on. It is a simple, profound, gracious telling and reminder of the truth. We are situated, as several have already acknowledged, we here are situated on the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Massachusetts and alongside the lands of the Nipmuc and Wampanoag nations. And it has brought me to consider and ask you to consider another acknowledgement, an acknowledgement of a time, the date and year when the first Africans were brought to this place and to your place, your geography, wherever that place may be. For us, that acknowledgement goes something like this. The first record of a group of African people arriving in Massachusetts is from John Winthrop's journal. In his July 1637 notation, John Winthrop wrote, "We had now slain and taken in all about 700. Those were Indians. We sent 15 of the boys and 2 women to Bermuda by Mr. Pierce, but he, missing it, carried them to Providence Isle. William Pierce was the captain of the Desire, which was built in Marblehead and sailed out of Salem. Providence Isle was a Puritan settlement off the coast of Central America. In an entry dated February 26, 1638, Winthrop wrote in his journal, "Mr. Pierce, in the Salem ship, the Desire, returned from the West Indies after 7 months. He had been at Providence and brought some cotton and tobacco and Negroes from thence, and salt from Tortugas. Dry fish and strong liquors are the only commodities for those parts. He met there 2 men of war set forth by the lords of Providence with letters of marque, and they had taken divers prizes from the Spaniard and many Negroes. We know the name of the ship, the name of the captain, the name of the recorder of the events, yet today, after 383 years, we have not one of the names recorded of the 17 indigenous people sent, nor of the enslaved Africans brought. If we are on the verge of a new normal, if when we all come back together in person in this church, meaning to be different, then it will mean for us and for all we tell a time when we decide to tell the truth and teach the truth about all that history which has been lost, stolen, or strayed. The story of all the peoples who founded this nation and worked to continue to transform it today. Here on the land of the Massachusetts, which Europeans invaded in 1630 and Africans were brought in February of 1638. Almost 60 years ago, James Baldwin wrote The Fire Next Time. In it, he called this work Achieving Our Country. If we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious blacks, do not falter in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. He wrote, if we do not now dare everything, the fulfillment of the prophecy recreated from the Bible in the Song of a Slave is upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time. Please, please, members of the Episcopal City Mission, please, Christians, Easter people in a Good Friday world, please let us not falter in our duty now. We are able, small group of followers of Jesus, handful that we are, able to end the racial and economic nightmare of so many and achieve our country and change the history of the world. If we do not dare everything, the fulfillment of that prophecy will be upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time.